yeah, I'd like to start my presentation today. But before that, let me just quickly check if you could see my presentation already. Can you see my screen?
Yes,
Yes,
sir.
sir.
All right. Okay. Thanks for confirming. Okay. So my presentation today is really going to talk about how do you write the methodology section of your research paper. No? And I'd like to what do you call this stuff? To call my presentation a quick guide to writing the research because while research takes a long time, no, our meeting today will really just focus on like the necessary things and like the what they call this guys siguro I would call like the key things that you need to know about research methodology. I'm pretty sure class no as what was mentioned by the hosts earlier, last time you already work on your papers, you already work on your research papers class, and that's good. So basically, what I will share with you today is maybe like a supplemental information or maybe a couple of additional information plus additional knowledge. Hopefully, no, you will learn something new from my presentation today. Now, I'd like to start the presentation by asking you guys. No, you may answer this in chat. No, I'll try to take a look at the chat as well. But if you, I mean, the first time that you heard the word research, or whenever you hear the word research, guys, um, what's the first thing that comes to mind? You hear the word research. Unsa man ang mga ang first nga mauna ninyo? Right? Be honest, guys. No? I don't mind if you say difficult, kapoy, stressful. Go ahead and do that. That's your like real perception about research. So yeah, again, you can type your answers in chat, and we'll go ahead and read a couple of answers that's based on again your responses. So we have one who says exploration. That's good. Readings, yeah, diba? According to like Ceballos, like a lot of readings. I read a meme class no, na research is about reading 60 different articles and writing one sentence about it, which is funny because that's true, diba? You read like the literature, 60 different papers, and you can only write like one sentence about it, which is funny and again tiring class. So yeah, it's good because most of your responses here like positive in yung perception class no about research. And I know for sure class that some of you maybe has like or basi na po yung mga tawag ni class mga reservations or mga padlock no when you hear the word research. Diba? And I would like to illustrate you know because this is also my reaction or this is also what I feel whenever I hear the word research kasi Murag si Chris Aquino nga gasyagit kas no na kanang research na sad. We have to spend nights na sad, diba? Working on our paper, gathering the data, and like looking for respondents, right? And typically, 3 to 4 people are in a research group, or 2 to 3 people, sometimes individual gani. And again, I know it's stressful, I know it's hard class, and I understand all of those things. No, um, however, class, no, before I talk about methodology, I just like to talk about like research in general. Um, even if no, we don't want research as much as we want to avoid research class, it's an inevitable part of our lives. No, especially no that you are all going to be educators in the future, right? Therefore, class research is very important. No? So why man class? I'm pretty sure you already have an idea, class, no? Why it's inevitable, class, why it's always going to be part of our lives as educators and you guys as future educators. Number one, of course, because of professional growth, diba? Right? Later on, class, no? I'm pretty sure now this is not going to be your last, even after you graduate from like your bachelor's degree or you complete your bachelor's degree, for example, class. I'm pretty sure it's not going to be your last degree, right? You will work on another degree, perhaps your master's or unsa pa ba lang yung mga degree class. And right, to achieve that class, definitely you will need research method class. So again, it's an inevitable part of our lives as educators because number one, no, if you're able to produce a research, that means just na you have a proof, no, that you are an expert of a specific field, no, and diba, what's the contrast? I mean, what's the implication of that when you are a contrast, when you are an expert of a specific field? That means that you'll be able to share knowledge better, diba? You'll be able to teach your students better because, again, you're an expert of a specific field. And another thing was, no, educators, you guys, no, or we all here, no, are going to be lifelong learners, right? Um, Bisag, for example, kasi graduate mo, yes, wala na exams, yes, dili na may magtuon. Nope, that's not going to be the reality class, right? You're going to be teachers. You're definitely going to, what you call this, improve or learn new things. Again, I'd like to call ourselves, no, lifelong learners. And the research process is exactly that, no? It's about discovering new things. It's about learning new things, thus, and being able to publish it or being able to share it to other people, right? So again, that's why research is important. Now, based on no, I've mentioned what I've mentioned earlier na um, daghan man kay mahadlok sa research, diba? Like the very thought lang nga naka-research subject for this particular SAM. Like daghan kay mga tao nga ma-nervous, diba? Daghan kay mga tao nga ma-stress. Well, that's going to be a normal part, I would say, no, of the research process plus. But there's still a couple of things that we can do. So how do we bridge the gap then? Diba? Diba? How do we make ourselves, no, become more comfortable with research? Diba? From I can't do it to I can do it. Diba? Instead of like what you call this, like being afraid with research, how do you make yourself, you know, feel confident that you can do it at the end of the day, right? So to answer this question, class, no, I would like to use research theory, no, that most most researchers or a lot of researchers use as a theoretical foundation, and we call that the information, motivation, behavioral skills model. And according to this model, class, it's pretty simple. In order for us to gain a skill, or in order for us to learn a skill, let's say, for example, research skill, we have to have information, that means knowledge, and we have to have motivation as well, right? And I would like to emphasize that's the role of motivation here, okay? Because information, we can access that anytime. We can always open the books, we can always access the internet and get new information. But motivation is something that we need to work on ourselves, diba? We need to like instill in ourselves that. And that's exactly, you know, that's exactly my goal for this particular session. I don't want to just like relay information to you, but I also want to like motivate you to do research in the future. And if you try to take a look at the arrow here, class, it's two-way, right? If you have information, it's more likely that you're going to be motivated to learn the skill, as well as if you implant or instill motivation to yourself, you're more likely going to like learn a lot of stuff about research as well. So we're a two-way gan siya. So it's important that we implant information to you guys as well as motivation. At the end of the day, you'll gain what we call research skills. Right? Again, in general, oops, sorry. In general, plus according to information, motivation, behavioral skills model, in order for us to develop research skills, we must have number one the information, the knowledge, which is why we're doing this, and which is why you've enrolled in this class, which is why it's part of your curriculum now, class. And most importantly, we need you guys to be motivated to be researchers in the future, or like to contribute to the field of knowledge or to the body of knowledge that we have today. Okay? So that's pretty simple, right? So I hope no, as we go along the way, again, I can not just share information, but I can also motivate you guys to, you know, do more research in the future. Okay, because that's what as teachers we need that. At the same time, because if you try to take a look at it, in the Philippines, there are lots of problems or lots of issues that we can address using research class. Okay, now let's talk about the meat of our session today, which is going to be about methodology. So again, methodology is something that you're very familiar with already. And I would just like to siguro review class, no? What is it? How do you write it? And lisod ba ni siya suwaton class or himuon? Okay? Firstly, I would like to siguro no draw or put a kanang kwan class, a comparison sa research, I mean sa methodology and like sa recipe. Because if you try to take a look at it, plus writing your methodology section is like writing a recipe, diba? And I'm pretty sure you're very familiar with recipe. Like for example, kamo muluto. I know a lot of you guys muluto sa inyong balay, diba? And whenever like lamit lagi nang giluto for today, no? And in that particular case, does you write it down, diba? You write what you did, you write the ingredients that you used, diba? And you write the entire process, thus to make sure na later on when you want to cook that dish again, you'll be able to copy exactly what you cook right now, diba? And that's the point of recipe. So again, don't overthink methodology, class. Instead, think of it as if you're writing a recipe. A couple of general things about methodology. Number one, this is the section of your research that explains the concise and accurate detail, the procedures you followed in conducting your study. Okay, again, going back to the comparison that I made earlier, it's just like a recipe, class. And the goal, why you want it to be very concise, the reason why you want it to be very accurate is for your research. I mean, it's for your readers, that is for your audience, no? To completely understand your research and can replicate the exact same study that you did. Okay? So let's say, for example, if you've read a couple of literature class, a couple of journal articles, a good research methodology is contrast, no? Is a methodology wherein pag read mo class, na naki-understanding yung methodology, and you can exactly copy what they're trying to do. Okay? Ganun kailangan man i-copy, class. Ganun kailangan man nga ma-replicate nila. Because, di ba, whenever you conclude something, di ba, if you try to remember or recall, class, the principle of reliability, right, of your research and validity of your research, that means that if you produce, for example, a particular conclusion, if you do the research all over again, your conclusion must still be the same, right? If other people can't replicate your study, can't replicate your research, and can't get the same results, that means there's a problem in your methodology. That means your research is not exactly as good as as you think it is, right? There might be like, let's say, for example, you were able to conclude that all students are like this when presented with this information. But then one researcher in, say, for example, in the USA, tried to copy your research, tried to replicate what you did. And apparently, they weren't able to get the same results. So either there's a mistake in what you did, or perhaps like there's just some cultural differences that whenever, I mean, there's just like your generalization is only limited or can only be applied to a certain extent. Diba? And that's why, because if you try to take a look at the theories, like for example, learning theories, nila Bandura, like learning theories, for example, say for example, kung ilang Skinner, like those are basically all theories. And if you want to test it in the Philippine setting, among Filipinos, then all you need to do is just to copy the methodology, right, and prove, or like confirm if you can get really the same results. For example, say for example, the reinforcement theory, if you reinforce a child, if you give them rewards, they're most likely going to do that behavior again. If you can replicate it, then that's a good research. Okay? And going backlash, that's the importance of the methodology section, right? We want your audience, we want your readers, to understand what you did, to completely know what you did, so that they can replicate the exact same thing. Okay? Furthermore, ganong importante man plus ang methodology. Why can't we just go straight to the results? Why can't we just write the results? Because, the results section is beautiful because we can conclude, for example, that this thing, we're able to discover this thing, right? But if you try to take a look at it, class, your results are contextual. Meaning to say, you cannot really interpret the result independently of your methodology, right? That means that kung sa man imong resulta sa imong research, that is actually tied with your methodology. right? Hence, class, it's important, that you write the correct methodology and you conceptualize the correct methodology, class, because again, um, it's a prerequisite since it describes how the results were made or how the results were gotten, class, in the first place. To illustrate an example, let's say there's a study that concluded na Filipinos are happy people. So take note, Filipinos are happy people. So, mo nang iyahang conclude, right? And nindot kayang conclusion, right? Nindot kayang result. And you found out na, oh, it's very insightful, and we've certainly added to the body of knowledge that we currently have. But, when you try to check the methodology, apparently they weren't using non-probabilistic sampling method, right? And if you're not using non-probabilistic sampling method, what does it mean, right? So may pasabot anak class, if you remember your statistics class, you cannot generalize it to the entire population, right? Your results are only limited to the sample that you tested in that particular research, right? And again, where can you find the sampling method? You can find that in your methodology, thereby proving that methodology is a really important part of your research paper. Okay. If you have any questions, as what was mentioned earlier, you can jot it down for now, and later on we'll have a portion where we can discuss a couple of your questions. Okay. So again, this is just an overview, of what the methodology is for. Okay. In my next slide here, right? Let's talk about the technical requirements of your methodology section. Generally, class, your methodology section, should contain about 4 to 5 subsections, thus, and that would include the design, the participants, the measures or the tools that you use, the materials, and procedures. Okay, take note, this is just the general requirement of your methodology, right? So there could be, some institutional requirements. Let's say, for example, if you write a thesis task and have it defended in the University of Cebu, Lapu-Lapu, and Mandaue, so UCLM can provide their own institutional guideline in terms of how you can write your methodology. Okay? And these are the different sections, that are recommended, or the subsections that are recommended in writing your methodology. You have the research design, you have the research participants, research environment, data collection procedure, data analysis procedure, the rigor of the study, and lastly, the ethical considerations, right? So these are the recommended subsections of your methodology, or subsections of your methodology part of your research paper. Okay, I will go through each subsection here, but before that, I would just like to discuss a couple of writing principles, like what are the things that we need to remember whenever we write the methodology section. Okay, and here are a couple of the writing advices, right? First, of course, and I think you should know this by now, you need to always use formal language because a research paper, right, is an academic paper, right? Therefore, it will require formal use of language. I'm not sure if guys, or you can use, like, for example, the shortcuts we're used to, like when we're doing texting or chatting class. So, and even informal use of the English language, it's not acceptable, write a paper like a paper. Typically, or usually, class, the methodology is in past tense, and you should use the passive voice. The reason is that it assumes that you have already conducted the paper or the research, and you are just narrating what you did, right, for the entire paper. Although, class, this is not applicable if you're still writing your proposal, right? Because for proposal, you need, of course, to use future tense because you're still planning, in carrying out that particular research. So there's a difference. Okay? Second, should generally be written in third person. Okay, although there are certain exceptions. Like some journals, no, if you want to get your papers published, they would accept first person point of view. But generally, again, the point of view of your methodology section should be in third person. Okay? And this is a tip that I want to give us. No, sometimes, when we write something, and it doesn't have to be in like it doesn't have to be for writing research papers. Sometimes even writing essays, right? We get stuck, with the rules of grammar, such that we cannot proceed anymore, right? Because I think there's something wrong grammatically with what I'm currently writing right now, and you just wrote two sentences so far. So what I do suggest is, when you're writing the draft, don't allow the rules of grammar to delay you from writing, right? So you go ahead and violate the grammar rules or the grammatical rules. But of course, later on, you're gonna have to review, you're gonna have to read, you're gonna have to proofread your paper anyway, and that is when you will be correcting your grammatical issues if there are any. Okay, so this is what I suggest us whenever you write your methodology section, and even in your research paper in general, especially when you are writing, for example, your review of related literature, or you're writing your introduction, where you have to write lengthy paragraphs. And of course, I would understand in other cases that it's hard to think of something because again, writing is hard, right? And in that particular case, this is my suggestion. Again, don't allow the rules of grammar to delay you from writing. But of course, this is not to say that you should violate grammatical rules, right? You shouldn't still violate the grammatical rules. It's just that what you need to do is just don't allow the rules of grammar to stop or to delay you from writing. So delay, the key word is delay, because if you allow it to delay you, then you're not going to finish your research paper. Okay. And lastly, and I think historically, when we think of like theses, when we think of research papers, like traditionally, like we always think that it should be lengthy, right? So we always think that it should be as thick, for example, as a, I don't know, like the Bible, for example, right? But in reality, plus, we have evolved, and right now, plus, it's more appreciated if you use brevity in your language. So when you say brevity, means go straight to the point, right? If you can make it shorter, then shorter. But of course, that is not to say that you will compromise the points, for example, that you want to say, right? If, for example, to make a comprehensive explanation of a particular thing, you would need to write lengthy sentences, right? That's fine. But if it's not needed, if you can write it in short sentences, then go ahead and write it in shorter sentences, right? You don't need to, again, attain, for example, a specific word count in research, right? And if you try to take a look at published researches, for example, it's even shorter. Okay, so again, brevity at all times. These are just again some of the a couple of like writing principles that I advise you to follow. And again, this is based on experience and based on feedback of other people that I know of as well. Going different sections of your methodology, right? As I've mentioned earlier, we have 7 different sections, and that's the recommended section as when you write your methodology section. Let's go ahead and start with the research design. Okay, so the research design is the first subsection of your methodology section, and from the word itself, it should explain, it should detail the design that you used in your research. Okay, just a couple of things. This subsection opens the method section by describing the study's design, right? You have to describe the general design, whether it's qualitative, quantitative, or you use mixed methods, right? Then you describe the specific designs that you use. Is it descriptive? Is it experimental? Is it correlational, etc.? Or if you're using qualitative, what kind of qualitative paradigm would you use? And this is also where you define your variables, right? So if applicable, for example, this is where you mention what is your independent variable and what is your dependent variable as well. Okay, and we just need to go back a little to the research questions, because your research questions or your statement of the problem will actually define what your research design is, right? So let's say, for example, your research question is descriptive. Okay, so that means your goal is to describe something, right? It could be like this question that you see here. What is the level of test anxiety among students, right? This is a very descriptive question. And if you go ahead and describe your um, research design, right, based on that research question, then it's definitely going to be descriptive, right? So if you've measured um, level of test anxiety, right, quantitatively, and then your goal is just to describe the level of your of the test anxiety of students, then it's going to be quantitative. Then you use descriptive uh, design specifically. Or it could also be correlational. Diba? Your goal is to see relationships between or among variables, right? So, an example of a question that is correlational, class, a research question that is correlational would be: is there a relationship between test anxiety and academic performance? Like, meaning to say, you would want to know if test anxiety would increase as academic performance increase, or like vice versa. Is it like negative correlation? Is it positive correlation? So in that particular case, then if that is your research question, then you should describe your design as correlational. And again, most of the time, if it's correlational, it's going to be quantitative, right? And lastly, diba? If it's experimental or if it's causal, right? Meaning to say you want to see whether there is a cause and effect between two particular variables. So the example of a research question here would be: does level of test anxiety affect academic performance? So if like there's a cause and effect, you're trying to establish cause and effect, then your research design should be described as experimental or causal. Okay? That is again a review of how research questions and research design are related to us. Here, I want to show you an example. This is a published paper, no? On It's an investigation of a relationship between test anxiety and academic performance in secondary schools in Kenya. Okay? So if you try to read, for example, how the researcher described the research design, so they would start by saying the study used mainly the relational comparative ex post facto research design to determine whether test anxiety among students vary with time. So before or after examination. So it's very direct, no? So at first sentence pa lang, class, of the research design part, they already describe what kind of design the research is employing. Okay, and if you go ahead and read the second part of the research design section, the relationship between test anxiety and academic performance was also determined. So if you go ahead and take a look at the description earlier, no, as I've mentioned here, this is where variables are defined, identifying the independent and dependent variables. So the fact that they said here that they want to know whether test anxiety and academic performance has relationship with each other. So this is indirectly saying that these are their variables as well. Okay. And there's also a note here that the researchers did not have direct control of independent variables, and they were taken as they were in a natural setting, hence the suitability of the design adopted. So yeah, this is a great example, Kasno, of a research design. And if you want to read more about this paper, you can go ahead and search, for example, the title, class, right, and read the paper. Okay, so that is for the research design section. Now, if I go to the next part here, let's talk about the research participants. Okay, so I think no, by now class na you should be able to realize na methodology, no, is relatively easy to write, compared to the other parts of the research paper. Because the good thing about this part here is that you're just really narrating the things that you did, no? And just like writing a recipe, diba, you already did the dish, diba, you already know the requirements. So when you write it, it's going to be relatively easy. I'm not saying it's difficult, but in relation to other parts of your paper, this is relatively easy. So that's why I don't recommend, if you're working on groups, for example, and one person would be assigned to like the research methodology, ka, right? And like mona yung main, for example, contribution to your paper, because it's not going to be fair to those people who will be writing, for example, um, the related literature, like the results section and the conclusion. So when you're working in a group lesson, and this is a recommendation, don't divide it per section or per part of the paper. Instead, you divide it per subsection of each section. Say, for example, methodology. You don't assign the entire methodology to one person, but instead, like you need to divide or you need to agree, among your group, within your group, kung kinsa ang ma-assign, for example, sa kaninga part. So that it's going to be fair for everyone. That's just a tip, no? If you will be working on with groups in writing your paper. Going back, well, when you talk about the research participants, again, very straightforward. This is where you describe your participants in terms of the number. So how many participants participated in your research, right? The type of participant, the characteristics of the people you studied. So when you say characteristics of the people you studied, this is or this refers to the demographic information. So let's say, for example, let's say gender distribution, diba? Are most of your respondents males or most of them females? What's their ethnicity? No, to which socioeconomic status or socioeconomic class do they belong in? What's the age range? No, what's the religion? And it all depends on unsa ang characteristics ang inyong gi-assign or unsa yung kailangan may bawaan plus sa inyong respondent. So it doesn't have to be everything, but you need to tailor the demographic information that you need based on unsa yung ganahan nga i-analyze it with when you write your results class. At the same time, for convenience, this is also where you indicate how your participants were selected. Is it random? No. So did you randomly select the participants? Is it by convenience, right? Or all the other sampling methods that you have there? How were they recruited? Is it by email, right? Is it by referral? No, if you are able to find, for example, one respondent, then you ask that participant, kinsa ilang ma-refer. So that's like the snowball technique. Or is it personal? Like you personally approach the respondents or the participants based on, for example, based on the criteria that you have set. And of course, you can also signify if they were given any compensation. Like it could be in the form of snacks, or it could even be like monetary or financial compensation. I know a lot of researchers, especially those topics or areas na very difficult or very specific ang nilang criteria to meet the requirements, for example, also a research participant. So in that particular case, you need to describe as well if they were compensated. Or some people would choose to like do a raffle, no? So I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but I see a lot of people in online groups sa Facebook na they are recruiting participants, and if you volunteer, if you choose to answer, for example, their research, if you choose to become one of their participants, they would you would get like an entry to a raffle, say 500 peso load or like gift certificate. So you also need to describe that in the participant section, right? That's part of that's part of the description of how these participants were selected. Okay. Now, just to also explain just or see some differences, I know that there are a couple of papers that would choose to describe their participants in the results section. Okay, so not in the methodology section. That's fine, no, and that also works. Thus, but generally, if you describe your research participants, it should be under your methodology section. No, and I would like to show you a couple of examples. So one of the examples that I see here, again, a published paper published on the Journal of Educational Research, no, still on the topic of test anxiety, the effects of test anxiety and evaluative threat on students' achievement and motivation. So this is how they describe the research participants. No? So number one, they made sure that they specify how many participants they were able to recruit or participated in their study. The participants in this study included 61 baccalaureate and graduate students. So describing the educational attainment of their participants here who were enrolled in the Educational Research Methods course at a large university in Southeast United States. And then in the second sentence, the average age of the participants was 31.2 years and 77% were women. So yeah, again, observe how they were able to briefly describe their participants. Although take note, the reason why this is really, really brief, it's because it's published in a journal. And when you write a thesis, for example, or an academic requirement, it might be better to become more elaborate or more comprehensive in writing code. So there's a difference. Just to give you an idea, class, let's say, for example, you're able to finish your thesis, let's say in undergrad, or it could be in your master's, and you're interested in publishing your paper in a journal, you need to convert your thesis in a journal form. That means it's going to be shorter, brief, so mas bubo ang mga sections tas. Unlike sa full-blown paper, which is like, for example, in the case of a thesis. Okay. Another example that I have here. So this is a study on cognitive test anxiety and academic performance, published in the Contemporary Educational Psychology Journal. So if you try to observe, or if you try to take a look at how they describe their participants, so as you can see, students participating in this investigation were volunteers from an undergraduate educational psychology course at a large Midwestern university. So again, you describe an educational attainment of the participants as well as like the school they're currently affiliated in. The course that the participants were taking was required for all education majors, and participation in the study was one option for fulfillment of a course requirement. So they also mentioned here how many participants in total. So 168 students participated in the project. And of course, thus, they have described the mean age of the participants. And you always describe your participant class in general. Dili ka mo tagsa-tagsa, for example, sa ilang mga edad class. So what you do is just to get their mean age. So that's what is being shown here, class, in this particular example. And of course, the distribution of gender. So how many were females and how many were males, class. And also specified here, take note, if, for example, there is a missing like response sa inyong survey or sa inyong data, you do not answer it for them, class, in that particular case. You should never do that, right? Instead, you just specify in your results na they left it blank, right? So even if, let's say, for example, lalaki man to siya, diba? Or babae man to siya, So still, you need to identify or you need to describe instead that they left that particular item blank sa ilahang survey form. Okay? And let's say, for example, they missed a couple of important things on your tool or on your instrument, right? So you can still describe it in your research participants, right? Let's say, for example, a total of 168 students were interviewed or participated in the survey, but one participant was removed from the pool of participants due to inyong explain. So, for example, they only answered what they call this task, like a few um, class, a few items. Therefore, class, no? Therefore, it might become a threat, no, sa accuracy sa inyong data. So you choose to remove that particular participant. But still, you need to describe na you remove that one participant from your pool, right? So it's recommended that you do that. So you just don't magically let that participant disappear as if you never interviewed them. You can still include that under the participant section and describe those respondents that you chose na i-remove from the pool. Okay? So another example that I have here, no, this is a study on the effects of online flipped classroom on foreign language classroom anxiety and reading anxiety. So take note, no, at the start sa iyahang participant section, they describe the sampling method that they used, no, how they recruited or the method that they used in recruiting their participants. So they mentioned that convenience sampling was used to collect data from 66 first year ELT students at two different state universities in the context of first year compulsory course, blah, 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 blah. So again, you can also describe your sampling method under the participant section. Although there are contrasts, no? There are cases wherein researchers choose to make a separate section for their sampling method. That's also acceptable. Pero it's up to your discretion na class, especially if no limited ra gyapon ang imong ma-describe about your sampling method. Diba? So what's the purpose of having it separated from your participant subsection? So might as well class merge it together, diba? If when it comes to your sampling method, you did a lot of things, no? Na worth it na siya class is separate from your participant section, then you can go ahead and do that as well. So that's why that explains why class, no? In other papers, you would see na sampling method is separated from the participant section. So ayaw mo ka ko flip money. So it's not really, there's really no right or wrong class. It depends on your again discretion as researchers as well as the institutional requirements. So if your institution required you to separate it, then you need to go ahead and separate those sections. Okay. And as I've mentioned before, no, there are also cases that they have already or they already described the results basically, I mean the demographic data of their participants. So as you can see right there, no, participants of the research consist of 629 secondary school students, and they summarize the demographic features in table 1. So notice how they didn't make it in statement form. So they rather had it just in tabular form, you know, which is sometimes better, diba? It's better to visualize data sometimes compared to like have it written, which is, you know, sometimes confusing, can make very lengthy paragraphs. So if you can make it in tabular form or you visualize your data, then that's definitely better. Okay. And I would like to repeat, no, now there are cases that your demographic data will be described in your results section. And again, that's something that's acceptable, especially if your demographic data is really part of your statement of the problem or your research question. Okay. So ang research participant section is again pretty straightforward, and I've already shown you a couple of examples from published from journals. So let's move on to the next part here. And if you have any questions, again, please feel free to write it down, and I'll we'll definitely discuss that later on. Right. So for now, let's go ahead and discuss the next part here, which is your research environment. So this is going to be the third subsection of your methodology section. And this is pretty straightforward. It just describes the environment, the setting na diin mo gi-conduct ang imong study. So in general, it just describes the locale and the physical environment of the study. Okay? So say for example, in a study that I am showing you here, it's describing where is the locale of the study. So it's saying it's in Mindanao State University main campus, which is located in Marawi City. So basically describing maybe some geographical features of Marawi City, right? So you can also go ahead and do that. And more specifically, if you try to take a look at the second paragraph here, they also describe, asa specifically sa MSU nila giconduct ng study, which is in Princess Gawanin Hall Dormitory, and described that it's a girl dormitory with 2 wings. So yeah, that's actually how you describe the research environment. Okay. Now, if you try to read journal articles, they rarely put or they rarely like separate research environment with class, because like they either incorporated some procedures apart, no? So that can also happen, and that's the reason why the example that I posted here, that I shared you here, because is not a journal article. So this is a thesis that I found online as well. So I think ang research environment is pretty simple. Again, you just describe the locale and the physical environment where the study was conducted. Okay. Ooh, interesting. So I saw Ma'am Elna here, I'm sharing na she was able to share, she was able to stay sa kaninga call. Nga describe ani nga example I'm showing you here. It's great. Okay. Now let's talk about your data collection procedure, class. So the data collection procedure, it's pretty again, from the label itself, from the title of the subsection itself, it should describe how you collected your data. So if you try to take a look at the description here, this is where you describe how the data were collected in your study and in what order. So a couple of questions that you need to consider here is, number one, did the participants come to laboratory or classroom? Right. So sometimes in research, if you have like a laboratory, for example, in psychology, like there's a psych lab where experiments will happen. So if you ask your participants to really go inside a psych lab, so you need to describe that. Or if you just conducted it in the classroom setting. So in action research, that's pretty typical, or that's pretty usual, diba? Na you actually gather the data, right, inside the classroom. So you also need to describe specifically how you did that. If they participated online, then of course, that's also how you need to describe your data collection procedure. Second, you need to narrate what did the participants do first, next, and last. So that means, let's say, for example, your participants answered your demographic questionnaire first, then you need to describe that the data collection procedure. Okay. Now, this part is really tricky, guys, because if you notice, based on the different subsections of your methodology, sometimes na you might be confused. Saan man ako ibutang nasa akong data collection procedure since I've already described the other things in the other subsection. So that's why I would like to remind or to highlight no, na please be careful not to repeat information you already described in other sections. No? It is important that each element is presented only once in the most appropriate place and the most appropriate order. So if you feel or if you think as a researcher that this particular um, statement should be placed under maybe the research participants, no? Then you can go ahead and do that. Or, diba? Alternatively, your sampling method, if you choose not to create a separate section for your sampling method, can also be incorporated in your procedure, diba? Because your procedure narrates what you did, so you can describe how you recruited your participants here. So that's also another option that you can take for the data collection procedure. What you just have to remember is um, you do not repeat information, especially in the methodology section. Okay? One thing that I noticed as well, class, no, and this would apply sa tanan na mga section sa inyong methodology, right? There's a tendency to just describe, let's say, for example, what is a qualitative study, diba? Since, for example, in your research design, you use the qualitative design, no? And you describe it. So you define what a qualitative research is. And what you need to be careful of in that particular case is that you don't have to like really like define no, what's a qualitative study because your readers, say for example your panel, given that they were qualified to become a panel, or even like for example other researchers, no, would already know what a qualitative design is. So instead of writing a definition of a qualitative design, you only need to focus on the rationale as to why that is your design. No? So describe why you use that particular design instead of just defining that kind of design or that, for example, sampling procedure. There's nothing wrong with giving maybe a short description, but I've noticed no, na some papers would spend time describing, let's say, for example, probabilistic sampling, but they never, or the paper never discussed the rationale or the reason why probabilistic sampling was used or was employed as their statistical or as their sampling procedure. So you need to nuance it, no, to make sure that you describe or you explain why you use that and not just define that sampling procedure. Because most likely, your readers again would already know what that is. No? But unless, of course, it's a new method or it's something that's very unfamiliar, no, it's not written in the books. So in that particular case, you of course need to define those particular concepts, no, that that is new or that are new. Okay, so going back to the data collection procedure here, I would like to show you a couple of examples for the data collection procedure. The first one here is a study on the effect of WhatsApp chat group in enhancing English to foreign language learners' verbal interaction outside classroom context. So if you try to take a look at how they wrote their procedures, no, they started with 2 days before the participants took the second course exam. Students completed the 2 test anxiety measures, the procrastination, the procrastination questionnaire, the self-report, sorry, guys. Okay, here. All right. So here, Casto, they just describe what the participants did and when they did it. So that's standard writing of data collection procedures, and they even wrote or described the length of the data collection. So they mentioned here that each participant they took 20 to 30 minutes in like the data collection procedures took around 20 to 30 minutes and was conducted where? In the course testing location in groups of 20 to 40 students. So reading service was provided for one student with a visual impairment. So let's say, for example, there were exceptions that he did. Diba? In the case, for example, of one student na may visual impairment, so they had to accommodate this particular student. So you also need to describe all the exceptions that you did, especially in papers or in research topics that require a lot of control. No, so during the group data collection session, students also granted permission for access to their course exam scores. So the next part here, class, is more on the statistical procedures na. And the choice, class, in this particular context, they decided to merge statistical procedures or the data analysis procedure with the data collection procedure, class. Okay, so that's also possible. And I would like to show another example, in writing the data collection procedure. This is, I think, what I showed you earlier, cognitive test anxiety and academic performance. But this time, this is based on, this is under procedures part. So as you can see, all participants of experimental and control groups were administered to the pretest after a month prior to the beginning of the instruction. The participants had an hour per day and they were taught by a traditional method integrated with WhatsApp chat group, which only used text message. In this test, individually, each participant was interviewed to provide oral answers for the interviewee's questions, which were developed from the content that was taught in traditional class and practiced via text message on the WhatsApp chat group. So generally, class, if you observe how they wrote their procedures, they basically just narrated how they interacted with their participants from start to finish. So, mo nilang gibot at first. If you had to chat them via Facebook, then you can go ahead and describe that here. So participants will reach out via Facebook and they were asked permission or they were asked their consent to participate in research. So that would also how you would describe the procedure depending on, of course, what you used. That's good. Okay. So again, generally, the data collection procedure would describe how you collected your data from your participants. So if wala pa mo yung data collection procedure, class, it's good, as researchers, that you already take note of the processes or of the procedures that you did when you collected your data. So say for example, before writing your final output or final write-up, you had to collect your data first. So para mas sayon siya isuwat, class, so that it becomes easier to write. Then while collecting your data, you can describe or you can just take notes of all the things that you did. So for example, the first part I handed out, like for example, the printed questionnaire. Then second part, like I explained, I gave the participants a very brief overview about research. So para, class, when you are ready to write your report, when you're ready to write your methodology section, it becomes easier because you have already notes, you already have like your outline, you already have your data collection notes, and just translate it into a data collection procedure as part of your methodology section. So that's one thing that you can do. Although for sure, before you even start collecting your data, you need to write your proposal, class, and in your proposal, you need to visualize what you need to do. And if, diba, namang gidlay differences, ang proposal and the actual research that was done, so you still need to take notes, even if nana mo description of your data collection procedures in your proposal, but that's not what happened when you started collecting your data. Then when you report your final output, when you report your final thesis, you need to make sure that it is aligned with how you actually collected your data, right? Not how it was written when you were writing your proposal, your thesis proposal. Okay? Great. So that's for your data collection procedure. So now let's talk about the last, or not really last, sorry, but the fifth part of your methodology, which is your data analysis procedure. Now that you have your data, what did you do with your data? So, unsa yung gibuhat afterwards. So, this where all the statistics will come in, no? If you use a couple of statistical tools. Okay? But we go before we go to the data analysis procedure, because no, it's not part of the recommended section na here. But I would like to emphasize that if you use like certain instruments plus or certain psychometric tools, it is important that you describe each research instrument or tool that you use in your research. So you can describe each with, each one with its own short paragraph citing its source, sample items, relevant computations, and response options. So let's say, for example, no, you had to measure test anxiety sa mga students. So in your research instrument subsection sa yung methodology, you need to describe kung sa man siya nga test anxiety tool nga inyong gigamit to measure test anxiety sa mga students. Firstly, you need to acknowledge if it is something that you use no, from an already existing tool that you found maybe online, right? And in that particular case, you need to cite who is the source no, of that particular psychometric tool. And typically, you would need to ask for permission sa kantong developer sa nga tool. And just no, just to share my experience, no, when I was writing my thesis back in undergrad, all of the tools that I used, I had to email the creators or the developers of that tool, and they respond surprisingly very immediate. I mean, mas lang respond lang. So you can also do that. No? Let's say, for example, you see test anxiety tool online, like you needed to measure test anxiety, and you saw a tool online. So you just need to look for the researchers, no? Search for their institutional emails, which is pretty available, especially if it's published on a journal. And once you email them, like you have to like give them a brief overview of what you're doing and what you're doing, what's going to be the purpose of using their tool. And they're very generous, most of them. So I'm pretty sure like they would um, give you permission. No? But let's say, for example, you develop your own tool. So you need to also describe the development process. No? So how did you come up with the items, for example, in your tool? And what was the process to ensure that the tool is reliable and valid? No? That's actually one of the key things that you need to remember, the key things that you need to be reminded of when using any psychometric tool, or using any podcast research instrument. No? Sometimes, because we see like a very famous tool online, so you get excited to use that. You think that that's already applicable. But take note, less, no? There are a couple of threats to reliability and validity in that particular case. Let's say that tool was developed in a very Western setting. No? So in the US, such that when you see the items in that particular tool and you try to ask a Filipino those items, like they would not understand a thing because it's very Western. So in that particular case, you need to consider the cultural like validity of that particular tool class. Okay. Ang tendency is when you start gathering your data, and this is like beyond this is beyond the instrumentation, or this is beyond the methodology section na, but this is more on the conceptualization of your methodology. When you, for example, use a tool class that may not be culturally applicable to the population nga imong test class. So you are not measuring what you are intending to measure. So that's a set of validity, diba? So pwedeng ang imong mga participants are just answering for the sake of answering, diba? Just randomly shading, for example, or randomly responding to your instrument. And the reason why they're randomly answering your instrument is because wala man sila kasabot sa items. So that's why you also need to be very careful when it comes to using any tool that you see online. Unless no, you can see na even us as a researcher class, no, we can already assess if a tool is something that can be used, no, um, in your own participant class or in your own research. And now, when you use a particular tool, of course, that's, no, there are certain ways to make sure that validity and reliability are there. So, Mona class, as you can see here, you need to show relevant computations. No? And for example, for reliability and validity, there are a couple of ways to measure if a particular tool is reliable and valid in your own research. So that's why this is something that you need to consult with your statisticians if you're unfamiliar with it. That's actually the Cronbach's alpha. You need to calculate the Cronbach's alpha class of your tool. No? And let me show you if this is being shown here, class. But this is an example, no, of how a research instrument section is written. As I've mentioned earlier, you need to provide a brief description class of the tool that you use. You don't have to put the entire items here because the entire tool should be in your appendices or in the appendix. But you just need to pull in a couple of like items. Let's say, for example, the next question inquired about their teacher's friendliness, no, with responses ranging from very unfriendly to very friendly. So you need to like just give a brief description of what you are trying to measure, as well as how are the participants responding to it. Is it via a Likert scale, or basically what's the response type of your tool? Okay. Now let me see, class, if there is a, if I was able to show an example, let's see, or that has a Cronbach's alpha. Okay, here. So as you can see, class, at the bottom part of this particular research instrument section, like they calculated for statistical evidence to make sure that there's a reliability sa yung mga items. And whenever you use, no, quantitative na tool, let's say for example, nagamit mo og Likert scale, so you need to calculate class the Cronbach's alpha for that. Actually, there's an online calculator for that. So that you have to enter the data, and the Cronbach's alpha value will be shown to you now, right? So you also need to describe whether the results are statistically accepted. So in this particular case, no, they got like a correlation score of 0.92, and they just described, no, that they are statistically accepted. So this is also what you should do. No, whenever you provide a number, or whenever you provide like a digit, for example, saying you hang any part of your paper, like you need to ensure, no, that that is something that you that there is like a corresponding explanation to that particular value. One thing that I can comment though on this particular example is that when they said, no, that these results are statistically accepted, there's no citation as to asa nila gikan nga asa silang source when they say that these results are statistically accepted. So typically, when you say that these values are statistically accepted or typically accepted, you need to provide a citation kung asa na gikan nga information, right? Because again, it's proof that you reviewed your literature. It's proof that it is based off on actual and real statistical acceptance. Okay? And if, for example, there were more processes, no, in proving the validity and reliability of your tool, let's say, for example, in their particular case, no, they had to have 5 experts, content experts, validate the tool that they use. So you also need to describe that process. So let's say, for example, the tool before data collection was validated by a content expert. You know, could be like pila ka ba content expert, for example, and nag-validate ng a tool. So you can describe that under the instrumentation or under the research instruments department. Okay? And they also describe, as you can see here, na on the light of their comments. So if they ask, for example, a couple of things to be improved, no? So they mentioned that the instruments were put in their final draft. So whatever let's say for example the expert asked them to change a couple of things, so they change it and make sure that the final draft follows what the expert were saying. So mana siya class, that's for research instruments. Again, what you need to remember here is number one, you need to describe your research instrument. What's the source of your research instrument? And then of course you need to provide proof of its reliability and validity. So reliability can be statistically calculated, while validity can be can be supported by your content expert. So basically, if you have a content expert approving your tool, no, that's already a sign or that's already a proof of um, the validity of your research instrument. Okay, nga nung important man class, if you use any instrument, right? The reason is that no, if you measure something no na dili day reliable, meaning to say class no, if let's say for example you were asked to take if you were asked to take an IQ test using a tool na lahi-lahi og score each time you take the test, it's not reliable. Therefore, class, whatever conclusion that you make out of it is also not reliable. No, so it's typically inconclusive or basically inconclusive. Class. So, well, class, just to illustrate this, let's say for example, no, nag-measure ka BP, di ba? BP is can be easily measured, the blood pressure, di ba? So if your tool, let's say for example, imuhang like the BP meter that you use is faulty, no? It's giving you different values each time. No? Bisag high blood ka kay, karon high blood, the next time you measure it, dili na. So the problem is reliability. It doesn't give you accurate results or consistent results. So same goes for your psychometric tools, class. So if it doesn't give you consistent or reliable results, then it would also confound or it would also cause problems in your conclusions later on. So might as well, no, before you start gathering your data, you need to make sure that your tools are validated, no, with its reliability and validity. So that's it for research instruments, no. And now let's go to the data analysis procedure class. So the data analysis procedure, which is the fifth part of our what do we call this um, research methodology section. This explains the procedures that you use to analyze your data. No, and the important things that you need to do here, class, is to cite your reference for all previously documented methods, including any statistical methods. So if you chose, for example, to use a t-test, or if you choose, for example, to use a or like for example like Spearman-Rao, you know, get the correlation coefficient, so you have to have an explanation or a rationale again anong kana man siya nga statistical tool ang imong gigamit. So I want to bring back no kasi I want to review na po as well class na what drives or what will determine the data analysis procedure that you will be using. We'll go back to your research question. So depending on your research questions, you will know class kung unsa ang data analysis procedure, for example, na ang inyong gamiton. So say for example, if it's a descriptive research question, you're just interested in knowing what is the level, for example, of test anxiety among students. So what you can do if you recall your statistics class is you want to know if you want to know like any form of measure of central tendency. So either mean, median, and mode. And typically, class if it's quantitative data, you would be interested like using mean as a measure of central tendency. So if you have the mean, that means you can already describe what is the level of test anxiety among students. So let's say in a scale of 7, no, 7 being very anxious, and you have a mean of 6.5. So therefore, you can conclude na you can describe the student's test anxiety to be very anxious. So in that particular case, if you're interested in knowing relationships between variables, then that could be correlational. So your measures of central tendency will no longer be enough, no, in knowing a relationship, for example, between two variables. So let's say, for example, you have a mean of 5 sa test anxiety between student A and a mean of 6 nga class nga test anxiety sa student B. without calculating class a statistical coefficient, you cannot really say that there is a significant difference or there's a relationship between those two items because or between those two students because again central tendency is no longer enough. So that's why you need to work with your statistician to maybe calculate the appropriate statistical coefficient. Let's say, for example, no, typically, if you are interested in knowing a relationship between two variables, you need to like calculate the R coefficient. It could be Spearman Raw, could be like the Pearson coefficient, depending on the type of data that you have. Plus, or it could be chi-square. No, and again, this is something that you would need guidance from your statistician. Okay, and in that particular case, thus, once you have like for example, your statistician suggested that this is what you're going to do, you need to describe, you need to provide proof na nung kana man ang direction nga inyong i-go through when it comes to your data analysis procedure. And you cannot just describe it based on, for example, like wala kay citation. So this is where citation comes in. So you need to look for resources or references as to why you'd be using this particular statistical procedure over the other. Okay. And if it's comparing means, so you also have corresponding statistical analysis for that particular part. Okay. So moving forward, class, we stopped discussing our at this discussion. So we were talking about the data analysis procedure, and before I ended, I talk about how your research question will actually determine the data analysis procedure that you will be taking or that you will be doing. Okay, so talk about how if it's a descriptive, then most likely you're gonna calculate the measures of central tendency, relational, like any correlation coefficient, and experimental. You're definitely going to compare means. So theta, ANOVA, or man with mu would be applicable. So in terms of writing your data analysis procedure, right? I would just like to emphasize here, no, na you need to also be able to describe any statistical software that you use, no. Let's say, for example, if you use Excel or if you use SPSS or R or any of the other statistical softwares that we have today, you can also identify or define that at the data analysis or in the data analysis procedure section of your methodology. Okay? If, let's say, for example, you computed manually, so you know just use the formulas and you had to like solve a couple of things. I would like to emphasize that the actual formula is not needed to be shown sa data analysis procedure. Instead, you can just go ahead and put it sa appendix, but you can reference it sa appendix section. I mean, sorry, sa data analysis procedure section. So let's say, for example, for the actual computation of, let's say, the R coefficient, see Appendix A, see Appendix B, or see Appendix C. So that's how it's usually done, right? You don't have to put the entire formula sa data analysis procedure. You can choose to put it sa appendix. So usually, any form of like calculation or even like the tools that you use, that should be under your appendices or appendix sections in your research paper. Okay, now let's take a look at a couple of examples. So let's go back to this particular study that I showed you earlier on test anxiety and motivation levels. So this is how they describe their analysis of the data. So as you can see there, they use SPSS 22 program for analysis, and they also explained what are the different statistical procedures they did. So um, they calculated for the frequency and percentage of the demographic features, and of course, they also measured the arithmetic mean to determine the student anxiety and motivation levels. So this is to answer your descriptive questions, diba? And diba usually you just don't have like descriptive questions, and maura na napod may correlational questions. So you would also describe, no, how you would analyze your data to answer your correlational ng mga research questions. And in their case, no, they are actually comparing means. No? So as you can see, they analyze their data by conducting an independent t-test. And this is where I actually pointed out, this is actually what I pointed out earlier Kasto, na when you explain the rationale kung nanong mauna inyong i-calculate, you have to cite your source um, in that particular instance. So your readers can, let's say, um, if I want to explore good no ang reasoning anak kay it's outside of your field naman, it's for the statisticians to answer naman. So what they need to do is just to read the paper of this individual, and when they read the paper, so they'll be able to understand better kanong katuman ng mga procedures, katuman ng mga statistical procedures ang inyong use. Okay? So make sure na you are able to what they call this cite a source plus sa any interpretation or sa any procedure nga inyong gibuhat for data analysis. Let's take a look at another example. So in this particular case, they are katong ganina class no, looking at the effects of online flipped classroom on foreign language classroom anxiety and reading anxiety. So they explain class no, the pretest data was assessed for normality, so this is the first step, and then they had to calculate for the Kolmogorov-Smirnov coefficient using SPSS. No, so this is what they were what they call this as they used to calculate. And in addition, the skewness and kurtosis values were computed. So you don't have to show it sa data analysis. You don't have to write it. You can refer the table 1 test to what they call this test to show no the values. And as I have mentioned earlier, class, no, they also explained why that is their calculation class or ganong mauna ang ilahang data analysis na sa tool na ginagamit or gigamit. They cited Horwitz and others class here, no? So again, to provide a rationale ganong kanang reliability analysis ang ginagamit. And this is again to reiterate what I said or what I mentioned earlier, na if you are to choose any, for example, statistical procedure, make sure you back it up with like a citation. Para kung pakutan mo, for example, ganun ka naman, at least no, you can reference these individuals that who are most likely statisticians, for sure. So yeah, again, no, the tool or the software that you use, if there are any, you can also describe that under the data analysis section. Okay, so that's it for the data analysis procedure. Now let's go ahead and talk about the rigor of the study, right? So that's the sixth section of your methodology, and a general overview no, of the rigor of the study. This is really for, oops, sorry. Okay. This is really usually needed for qualitative studies, no? Na in a way, class, this is for you to establish your trust or confidence in the findings of a research study. No? It allows the researcher to establish consistency in the methods used over time. It also provides an accurate representation of the population study. Now, why is this necessary for qualitative studies? If class is qualitative, there's a huge tendency for the researchers to be biased. No? So based on their personal experiences, for example, because they're dealing with qualitative data. So let's say, for example, this is how I interpret this qualitative statement to be. So there is no a degree of like participation on the side of the researcher in the analysis of data. So in that particular case, if you don't maintain a level of rigor, there's a tendency na you made or you skewed your results to be aligned with what you want to have or the results that you want to have. So to avoid that, you need to define your contrast, the procedures that you took, to make sure that you don't have or to make sure that you avoid any chances can bias ang imong results because you participated as a researcher. So in that particular case, you need to define credibility, transferability, dependability, and confirmability as well. So let's talk about each section or subsection of your rigor of the study test. First is the credibility. When you talk about credibility, this allows others to recognize the experience contained within the study through the interpretation of participants' experiences. In order to establish credibility, a researcher must review the individual transcripts, looking for similarities within and across all participants. No? And this is actually class. I'm not sure if you have done a qualitative study in the past, or one way no of analyzing your data if you are employing a qualitative design is by thematic analysis, right? So you'd have to come up with themes, or you'd have to take a look at your data and make sure that you are able to identify themes sa mga sa mga responses ng participants, especially no if they're interview data, diba? So this is pretty common if you are understanding, or if your study is about like phenomenological experiences or mga live experiences no, of people, wherein they really expound no, on the responses. So in that particular case, as a researcher, you need to be able to create themes based on your responses, based on your respondents' responses. Plus, now, when you consider a study to be credible, so it becomes credible when it presents an interpretation of an experience in such a way that people sharing that experience immediately recognize it. Okay, so in that particular case, if there's another person, let's say for example, one of your respondents shared a particular experience, there's another respondent, who immediately recognizes the same experience, like it's part of their lived experiences as well. So that's actually a way to prove that there's credibility in your study. So as you can see here, there is a couple of ways to make sure that you achieve credibility. You can go ahead and do reflexibility. You can do member checking, also known as informant feedback, peer examination. You can also go ahead and ask peers to examine or debrief your participants. And more importantly, class, in order for you to get the actual experiences and able to get a better understanding of your participants, there's a way, class, to do that by having a prolonged time with your participants. So there are research methods that allows you to do that. And lastly, using the participants' words in the final report. So you don't translate, or you don't like reconvey it or reword it. So verbatim na pag, let's say for example, class pag-cite sa mga participants' responses is in a way proving your credibility. Now, what is this in relation to the methodology section? Plus, you just really need to specify, or just really need to define or describe the steps that you took to make sure that your study achieves that level of credibility. Of course, we don't expect you to do everything, like from reflexibility and up until like like peer debriefing or all the other ways to ensure credibility here, class. But we just wanted to describe the steps that you took as well to at least have that level of credibility. Okay, so that's the first one. And the second is transferability. So when you talk about transferability, this refers to your findings or methods being able to, or like applicable, or the way that we can apply your your results in one group of people or one group of respondents to another. So this is related to external validity, meaning to say generalizability. So if this is your group of participants, and most of your participants are Filipinos, can we apply the same conclusion to the entire like Philippine population or Filipino population, for example? So that is the principle of transferability, class. which is a really important principle, especially for qualitative studies, right? Because qualitative studies have a limitation when it comes to generalizability because of the limited number of participants you always or that you need to like interview in qualitative studies. So there are still ways no to make sure that there is transferability in your qualitative study. For example, using the same data collection methods with different demographic groups or geographical locations. So let's say you did an interview, you did a research class for a specific group of people, and then you replicate it with another group of people of the same demographic or even different demographic profile. So you can go ahead and do that. So in a way, like that's to test no, whether your findings in one group of people is applicable to like the other group of people, or you can also give a range of experiences on which the reader can build interventions and understand to which whether the research is applicable to practice. So in relation to your research methodology section, just wanted to give you like a definition of transferability so that in your research methodology section, if you are doing qualitative, you will describe the steps that you took to make sure that there's transferability in your paper. So let's say, for example, did you try to make your participants diverse, meaning coming from a diverse background, so dili lang very similar, no? Like for example, you are trying to what they call this, make a generalization to entire college students, pero ang imong participants are coming from, let's say, like are all education students. So that's a very limited transferability, no? Because you only interviewed education students, but you wanted to make a generalization for the entire college students. So if you diversify, for example, your respondents, that could enhance your transferability. And that's exactly what you want to describe in this particular section. Okay. Another thing, aside from credibility, transferability, there's also this principle of dependability. So if you try to convert it to quantitative terms, this is basically reliability. So whether the same results can be replicated or if another researcher can follow the decision trail used by the researcher. So this can be achieved by Candy Class na yung mga steps 3, like describing the specific purpose of the study, describing how the data was collected and how long collection lasted, explaining how the data was reduced or transformed for analysis, discussing the interpretation and presentation of the findings, explaining the techniques used to determine the credibility of the data. So how do you do this test in writing your methodology or in your research? You can have peers participate in the analysis process. So this is more on, let's say, for example, Pesto, in coming up with a theme. So for example, in thematic analysis, you need to have multiple observers and not just one observer, for example. Otherwise, there's this tendency na, again, na bias sa one observer. But there are multiple observers and they seem to all agree with each other. Let's say, for example, 3 different people categorizing your qualitative data into different teams and you all agreed yamon ang categories na yung nakita, then that's a good sign that you have dependability or reliability in quantitative terms. Okay? In relation to your methodology section, class, what you need to do here is really just to describe the steps that you took in order, again, to achieve that level of dependability on your project. So it could be like you discuss in detail like the description of your research method. It could also be having another peer work with you during the categorization of the data if you use thematic analysis. Okay, so that's for dependability. And lastly would be confirmability, right? This is the last requirement for the rigor of the study. This is when credibility, transferability, and dependability have established. So qualitative research must be reflective, maintaining a sense of awareness and openness to the study of the results. Therefore, the researcher needs a self-critical attitude, taking into account how his or her preconceptions affect the research. So this is where you make or write caveats. Okay, you have to understand, class, now when you are doing qualitative research, there's always the factor of the researcher having a contest, a biased interpretation in something. So the confirmability section of your methodology just really describes certain limitations to the conclusions that you have, class, given the framework of your study. Okay, so again, you can take notes regarding personal feelings, biases, and insights immediately after an interview. So let's say, for example, no, you interviewed someone regarding their lived experiences, and you had certain biases or you had certain thoughts about the responses of your respondents. Therefore, that's to make sure no that it will not affect in your interpretation. You write it down no, after the interview, and then you describe the process class in the confirmability section of your review of the study, right? So, say for example, the researchers made sure that they contrast they write a remarks after each interview to express like all their biases, insights about the responses of the respondents. So again, just to make sure na walay bias ang usa ka researcher in interpreting the findings. So that's exactly what the rigor of the study is. So coming to rigor class, this is more on on how you set up your research that it is really free of biases. No, okay, if you have biases, that means that your result is biased. Therefore, your research is not really going to be that going to be that um, conclusive after all. Okay, so that's for the rigor of the study. Unfortunately, so I cannot show you examples for this particular part because I rarely see papers putting this one on their papers, which is why class. This goes back to the idea na a lot of, I mean, the qualitative area or qualitative research is actually a very good opportunity for you to come up with a lot of research topics because karon man good class ang tendency of people is to write quantitative papers, no, to make it quanti or quali mix. Because if they write a true quali paper, qualitative research class, it's actually difficult, right? Number one, it requires a lot of writing, no, and like you have to be able to interpret your results, no? And again, if you are not interested in writing, you hate writing, I wouldn't suggest that you undertake a research, a qualitative research. But if you are into writing, if you are into, let's say, interpreting, for example, qualitative responses, then qualitative research is for you. Okay? So personally, I am more inclined to quantitative research over qualitative research for the exact reason. Kaya matrabaho si qualitative research class when it comes to the interpretation of data. Okay, kung sa quantitative lang, it's very easy, di ba? Once you have like the statistical results, na rin like corresponding interpretation, very standard, no? Na you can like follow certain templates, and then there you go, you have your conclusion. But for qualitative data, yung pa ng katulgan class, you have to spend time with your data to really like understand your data. Tapos like maybe naka aha moment later on, oh maybe these are the themes that that exist here. So and then you write about it sa yung class. Again, matrabaho siya. Sayon maghimo og tool, di ba? Kaya sayon mag-come og questions, but the difficult part is interpreting the results compared to quantitative, wherein there is a difficulty in making sure that your quantitative tool is reliable and valid. So dira nga part medyo you need time to prepare your instrument, but once they're prepared and you collect your data, it's very easy to interpret them afterwards. So that's just the main difference between quali and quanti, and that is the reason why for qualitative data, you also need to really put emphasis on the rigor of the study to make sure that you avoid any biases that a researcher might have, given that dako siya og role in the interpretation of data. Unlike again, quantitative, it's statistics. No, you cannot lie about numbers, and you cannot you cannot make your own conclusions about numbers. Kailangan na may set rules. But qualitative, it's different. So that's why it's harder when interpreting qualitative data. Okay, so that's what the rigor of the study is for. And I'm not saying that you should be motivated to take on qualitative studies. In fact, I'm saying that you should be motivated to do this because this is a very a good area to establish theories. No, kanang mga theories that we know today, class, it started from a qualitative research. No, that's contrast. If you want to build theory, that's qualitative is the way to go. If you want to confirm theory, let's say for example, if social learning theory really works, you can design a quantitative research for that. Okay. Again, this is beyond class, but going back to research methodology for the rigor of the study, this is to make sure really that there's no biases involved, especially on the side of the researcher. Okay, and we're down to the last part of the methodology, which is your ethical considerations class. No, and this is really important today because no, in the past, if you have read a couple of classical studies, the classical journals, class, for example, they all violated a lot of ethical principles, right? So let's say, for example, Presto, there's a study done by Milgram, no, that electrocutes the respondents, the participants, basically harming them. No? Or if you know the Stanford prison experiment, no, basically imprisoning a group of people for a period of time. If you try to do those kinds of research right now, I'm pretty sure you will not get any approval from any ethics board that exists today. So, given that class, what is basically the ethical consideration section of your research paper? This is a subsection that describes the steps taken as a researcher to ensure the ethical integrity of your research. Okay, so if the research went through an ethical review process by an ethics board, the whole process should be narrated here. And most institutions right now, including University of Cebu Lapu-Lapu and Mandaue, have their own ethics board, right? That's why you cannot just collect data, no, without the approval of your ethics committee or ethics board in your thesis. So the ethics board, their goal is to check your methodology and make sure na there's nothing wrong with your methodology. You're not harming your participants, and you're ensuring the ethical integrity again of your research. So here, this is where you describe yung sa ninyo pag-process ang approval sa board. So that's one. You also describe here all the permissions that you ask, including sa participants, institutions. Let's say, for example, you ask an institution because you surveyed students from a different university. You also discuss that here. Informed consent. How did you ask consent in yung participants? You can describe that here. Confidentiality. How did you assure your participants that you're not just gonna spread their responses to everyone, diba? That it's going to remain confidential and for the purposes of research. So you have to describe that here. And more importantly, class, data management. You need to describe how you are going to manage your data. So karon class now, this is the trend now, and most ethics board would ask, how would you manage your data? Will you delete the data after 5 years, after 10 years? How long will you be storing the data? And how are you going to store the data? For example, inyo rin i-post sa Facebook, di ba? Ang inyong Excel sa mga responses sa mga OnePlus, Excel sa mga responses, for example, sa inyong respondents, inyong i-post sa Facebook, that's actually a violation of the ethical code class and could put you in jeopardy. So you make sure that the data class that you store in your computers are protected, and your respondents, your participants should know also about how you manage your data. So that's actually the trend right now. So in the future, perhaps that's no mas more detailed ang instruction sa mga ethical board about it. But basta class, what you need to know is that right now, ethics boards are looking into your data management phases. So again, it's really just about how long are you storing your data, no? And pila ka pantas asan you store ang data because it's important. And of course, a couple of ethical considerations during data gathering process, diba? So this is contrast where you describe if inyo bang ensure that your participants can back out if they're no longer comfortable with answering your questions or they're no longer comfortable being part of your research, or you violated that part tas kay inyo yung pugsan nga humanon even if they no longer want to. So all the steps that you took to ensure ethical integrity of your research should be described under the ethical considerations part. Okay? And I will show you an example here on the next slide. So, for example, a study on perfectionism and test anxiety among high school students. So this is how they wrote their ethical considerations. So for ethical reasons, several issues were considered by the Ethical Research Committee of University Putra, Malaysia, such as ensuring participants' voluntary participation and allowing participants to withdraw from the study at any time. So written consent, so they also describe how they obtain written consent from respondents and their parents, especially if your respondents are minors. Plus, so you need their parents' consent as well. So after the parents' consent was handed out, so they started distributing the questionnaires and returned to the schools by signed by the students. So only students who returned the parental consent form were asked to complete the questionnaire. So katong mga walay consent, of course, dili gid sila pwede. No, especially in the context of action research, where most of the time, the context is in the classroom, and kinsa man ang mga nasa classroom class, they're minors, they're children most of the time, especially in primary and secondary schools. So you have to be very careful. You have to really consider ethics tests when conducting research to these participants. Right? And in connection to your research methodology section, you need to write in detail how you made sure plus those ethical considerations, or how you made sure that ethics are on top of your priorities. Okay. Another example that you see here would be in the study of guided reflection on test anxiety among nursing students. And very simple, this is how they describe their ethical considerations. So ethical considerations used in the study were as follows: providing a letter of introduction from faculty, completing an informed consent form, confidentiality of student information, providing a certificate for the intervention group, and educational materials for the control group. Also, the study was approved by the Ethics Committee of Shiraz University of Medical Sciences. So in this particular case, you need to provide proof of the approval. So you can provide C Appendix D here for the approved form from your ethics board. So this is really a good point if you have like an approval from an ethics board, because that means to say that your research was really reviewed, for ethical considerations. And that's the last part plus of your research methodology. So in summary, I would like to say a couple of things. Thus, when we talk about the methodology, again, the purpose of this one is for your readers to be able to use your methodology section to conduct an exact replication of your study without asking any further questions. So they don't have to, or they don't need to email you anymore and ask for clarifications regarding your methods. If they had to email you, then that means your methodology section is not that well written. Okay? And second, this is something that I would also like to emphasize, that do not put the same information in more than one section. So you'd have to choose, and you'd have to assess asa ka ni siya part best is what. Right? So let's say, for example, if it's in your research participant section, do you think it should be added pa sa inyong procedures, or do you think na it's already good and it makes sense if you stay or you put it sa participants section? So again, it's your discretion to assess that. Just make sure that you do not describe or put the same information again. Okay? And of course, another important thing is brevity, right? So make sure that you don't write unnecessary statements. Make sure that what you are writing is essential for the understanding of your readers, right? If you think that you're just writing it for the sake of for the sake of having thousands of words on your paper, then I don't think that's a strategic way, of writing your paper. Brevity is the key, diba? If you can write it in few words, in few sentences, then that's really good. Okay, and with this, I would like to ask you this question again. If you were to describe research now in one word, and I'd like you all to answer this one in chat, how would you describe it? And yeah, you can contact us sa imong main takeaway sa atong session this particular morning. I'll give you maybe a minute to think of it class. Hopefully, no, na pre take away. Like you learned something new, and at least no, there's na boost in yung confidence class a little bit in conducting, even at least in writing your research methodology section. So yeah, type your answers in the chat. Okay, we have realistic, thorough. So research is about being realistic. That's true. Research is about being thorough. Very true. Systematic. It's complex. Yes. Okay. So I see a couple of responses now. So hopefully, Kasto, again, I hope na it was able to at least boost your confidence that's in writing. And that's really the main goal, class. Because if you don't have the confidence, you don't have the motivation, then you won't be able to finish your paper. But you will find reasons not to continue. You'll find more reasons not to continue than continuing it. So just build that confidence trust, and at the end of the day, like you'll be able to publish more papers. And who knows, diba? Maybe be able to establish a theory, confirm a theory, or maybe change theory that's already existing. Okay. All right. So future educators, no, I hope class na you become more motivated now to create your own research class. Not just no. I know like a lot of you like are in the end part now or latter part na sa inyong college journey. Hopefully you're starting to plan now, like kung sa mga interesting topics, ganahan mo i-take class, maybe in your master's degree, because I'm pretty sure contest no, it's really going to be useful for you, for your development, professional development, and you'll benefit your future students even more. Okay. Now, I would understand less, no, if there's still reservations, no, you're still not feeling that confident when it comes to writing your contest, writing your papers, no, and I would just like to contest to remind you all that if you're not feeling confident at this point, class, that's okay. Don't worry about that because research doesn't happen overnight, class, and it's a product of a collaborative process, no. So you will not conduct, or I'm pretty sure, class, no, in the future, you will not conduct research. And even right now, if you're working on a research right now without a mentor, without an advisor, class, and that advisor sometimes may be harsh, sometimes may be too harsh on you, hard on you, class, but definitely the criticisms is not really to attack you personally, but it's really to improve the paper at the end of the day, diba? And the goal is to add like more knowledge sa inyong field or unsay areas of interest sa inyo. So just think of it as na a collaborative process, no? So dili ka individual anak class, but you know it will take a village class to write the paper. So yeah, that's really it, Casto. I hope that you were able to learn a couple of things. And just Casto, before I officially end, by the way, I would just like to make a couple of tips, just especially right now, being able to make use of technology. Number one, class, interesting. We have Google Docs now. No, sa una class, no, during my time, during our time, we had to save our files to Word like final, so final, said final na dyan. And sometimes no, we miss a lot of things, di ba? We, imbes na save lang to siya, wala siya na-upload of print for some reason. So, use collaborative technology, class, no? So that you won't have to save it, download it, class. It's saved in the cloud, and if you want to make some edits or changes, dili siya mawala, class, no? At the same time, access to information is really easy now, no? So make use of Google Scholar. Google Scholar is a search engine, no? You can start from there. So if you search, for example, a keyword, you are working on a particular research, then just keyword class and you'll be able to find tons and tons of papers. And if there's a paywall class, there are always ways that, no? Diba, you have to pay to be able to download the paper. So there are always ways. Number one, email the researchers. That's the best thing to do. And I'm pretty sure, class, that they will reply, respond, and provide you a copy of the paper, especially if you're doing it for academic purpose. Second, class, you can find online. I'm pretty sure you can find ways class to unblock or to open that file even if na paywall class. So you could read the whole paper. At the beginning class, you can read a lot of papers because that's how you will learn. You can follow the writing styles at first, then eventually later on you'll develop your own writing style. That's always the best contest, no? You cannot be original when you start really. Like I'm not saying you plagiarize. It's a different thing class, but it's more on being able to follow the structure, no? And once you're very comfortable with the structure, you can create your own. And lastly, class, open science, that's the trend now, class. They're no longer putting their papers on paywall. So open data, so even data class are published, no? Of course, with the consent of their of the respondents na like para matest po sa ubang researchers sa same data set kaya lang na-gather. So they could come up with the same results plus. So let's say, for example, you need like secondary data. Just consult open science class. There are lots of like contests, um, resources or platforms that allows you to explore those different areas. Okay, those different open science platforms. And with that said, class, I'd like to thank you all for your listening. It has been a great day for me being able to share this one. And just wanted to let you know, class, no, research, you can never be an expert. No? You have to have an open mind to learn new things every day, class. Even if you become 70 years old and you have your PhD already, class, you need to collaborate with other people to become more open in learning. So open to learning.